Saturn's story can be called one of the saddest in the history of the American auto industry. It was not just another GM brand, but almost a separate company within the corporation, with its own factories, its own culture, and a fundamentally different approach to building and selling cars. For a time, it really seemed to work. Saturn was seen as something new, almost nothing like the typical American cars people were used to. In the end, the decisive blow did not come from the market or from competitors. GM first began thinking about creating a new car brand in the early 1980s. This didn't happen by chance. The market was changing quickly. Japanese and European compact cars were entering the US in growing numbers, offering low prices, efficiency, and solid quality. GM was still strong in traditional American cars, but when it came to compacts, they were struggling. Some models sold reasonably well, but inside the company it was clear they were falling behind the Japanese in technology, quality, and design. And that gap was only getting wider. At that point, Roger Smith proposed a radical solution. Instead of improving existing models or refining platforms, he wanted to take a step aside and create a completely new brand from scratch, one that would not be associated with GM at all, at a time when the company's reputation was already under pressure. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and by 1983 the first concept had already appeared. In November of that same year, GM showed the first Saturn prototype, nicknamed the Little Red Car. This was not just an internal presentation. President Reagan flew in for the event. Smith was extremely confident. He openly stated that Saturn would leap a full generation ahead of the Japanese, even considering what they were planning next. It was meant to be an American answer to the Japanese challenge, a new way of building compact cars that, in his words, would prove its historical significance over time. Reagan, after taking a ride in the Little Red Car, shared that optimism. He said he had no doubt Saturn could push the Japanese out of the American market. A year later, in 1984, the next prototype was shown in a much quieter setting, without Reagan and without the same level of attention. It was simply called the Saturn prototype, and unlike the earlier Little Red Car, it was much closer to a production vehicle. All of these prototypes were developed and presented before Saturn was even officially established, and before it was confirmed that Spring Hill, Tennessee, would become the site of its high-tech plant. The name Saturn itself had been chosen earlier in 1982. While the logo featured the rings of the planet, the name actually came from the Saturn rocket that helped the United States beat the Soviet Union to the moon. For an American automaker losing ground to the Japanese, the symbolism was obvious. Despite all the skepticism from the press, which doubted that GM could deliver on Smith's promises, Roger himself remained completely confident in the project. In January 1985, the Saturn Corporation was officially established. The new brand was meant to have everything of its own plant in Spring Hill, its own dealer network, a separate management structure, and employees trained outside of standard GM practices. Even the business model itself was designed to be different from the parent company. All of this cost GM around $5 billion, a significant amount even for a company of its size. The Spring Hill plant was designed to be as advanced as possible. The idea was that most of the work would be handled by robots and computers, while people would mainly oversee the process. This approach directly influenced the design of the first Saturn models. Plastic body panels mounted on a steel space frame simplified production, reduced painting costs, and made it easier to update the exterior design. For the engine block, cylinder heads, and transmission casing, GM used lost foam casting. This allowed parts to be produced in more compact and cost-effective facilities compared to traditional sand casting. The components were also lighter and required less machining afterward. Production was originally planned to begin in 1987, but in reality, it only started in 1990. Despite all the talk of automation, the plant was never fully robotic, and people still played a central role in the process. The first dark red sedan off the line was driven out by Roger Smith himself. The second model was the SC2 Coupe. Both cars featured a modern and distinctive design. As promised, they used a steel space frame with plastic body panels that were resistant to corrosion. Under the hood, buyers could choose between two 1.9-liter four-cylinder engines with either a single overhead cam or a dual overhead cam setup, producing 85 or 123 horsepower. A manual transmission was standard, with an automatic available as an option. The main innovation was not in the production process itself, but in the approach to it and to the business as a whole. Saturn's leadership believed they could take on the Japanese by using some of the same methods, and they introduced elements of the Kaizen system, which I covered in more detail in a video about the Geo brand. Like the Japanese, they focused on continuous improvement and quality. Workers were organized into teams that monitored every stage of production. When a defect was found, any employee could stop the line without going through layers of approval or waiting for decisions from above. Those decisions were made at the team level and made quickly. The hierarchy was also simplified. Regular workers were often present at management meetings, where they could openly share their opinions, point out problems, and suggest improvements. For General Motors, this was almost unheard of, since decisions had traditionally been made only at the top management level. Most employees came from other GM plants, and their average tenure was over 10 years. Even so, before starting work at Saturn, they went through intensive training to meet the new standards. Pay was also significantly higher, about 80% above the industry average. In the end, employees embraced the new corporate culture and worked to meet its expectations. No one wanted to lose a job like that, and it showed in the results. For the first time in a long while, GM managed to build a car that clearly surpassed its typical models of the period in terms of build quality and execution. The new organization of labor also led to a sharp reduction in conflicts with labor unions, something that had rarely happened at GM. The new approach extended beyond production and into how the company dealt with customers. Typical GM dealerships at the time had a poor reputation. The sticker price was often just a starting point. Buyers were met with pressure from salespeople, pushed into add-ons, and constantly steered toward closing the deal. In the end, they had to negotiate, and buying a new car became a stressful experience for many. The final price almost always varied and depended on how well you could bargain. Saturn chose to move away from this entirely and built its dealer network around a simple idea. You should not have to be a negotiator to buy a car. Cars were sold at a fixed price with no haggling. Dealers who tried to break that rule and return to old practices were removed from the network. It was not just about pricing. The buying experience itself became central. One customer later recalled that when she first walked into a Saturn dealership, no one approached her or tried to push a sale. When she asked about a test drive, she was surprised that the car was first taken to be cleaned and prepared, rather than rushing her into a decision. One of Saturn's smartest ideas was also one of the simplest. GM built a new dealer network from scratch, selecting partners based on customer satisfaction. Against that backdrop, many existing GM dealers looked outdated. They were used to receiving cars and waiting for buyers to show up, as had worked for years. Saturn dealers, on the other hand, focused on service and customer retention, competing not within GM, but directly with Toyota and Honda. As a result, Saturn dealers quickly became known as some of the best in the industry. And it did not stop there. Saturn went even further. In many warranty cases, the usual process was reversed. Instead of the customer going to the dealer, a service team would come to the customer. Repairs could be done on site, and if that was not possible, the car would be taken in, a loaner provided if needed, and then returned after the work was done. All of this was offered not to buyers of Lexus, Jaguar, or Cadillac, but to customers purchasing budget compact cars. Sales started strong. In the first year, Saturn sold 48,000 cars. The following year, that number jumped to 178,000, and a year later, it reached 286,000. These figures are even more impressive considering the brand was new and had only 2 models in its lineup. Saturn also avoided competing directly with other GM brands. Instead, it took customers away from Japanese manufacturers, which was exactly the goal from the beginning. Despite all the success, the strong reputation, and the technologies GM was able to develop through Saturn, the brand still was not making a profit. This was happening even with solid sales and a large base of loyal customers. At the same time, frustration inside GM was growing. Leadership from other divisions, such as Pontiac and Chevrolet, openly complained about the attention and funding Saturn was receiving. They argued that, regardless of the official numbers, Saturn was still pulling customers away from them. Saturn also did not rush to share its technologies with the rest of the company, despite being seen as the most advanced division. That only added to the tension. The bigger issue for GM was something else. By the mid-90s, Saturn once again required major investment. The entire lineup was essentially built around one model in different body styles. It had been updated several times, but it was no longer enough to compete with the Japanese. At that point, GM faced a choice. Continue investing and keep Saturn as a separate, unique brand, or cut costs and fold it back into the standard corporate structure. They chose the second option. This is how the Saturn L Series came to be, a mid-size model built on the platform of the European Opel Vectra. In essence, it was the same Vectra, slightly restyled and adapted for the American market. Nothing of Saturn's original philosophy remained, and customers quickly noticed that. The L Series sold poorly and could no longer compete with the Japanese. The brand had lost its identity, and the car itself was no longer built at the Spring Hill plant, but at a regular GM facility in Delaware. In its first year, about 90,000 cars were sold against a planned 200,000, and that turned out to be the peak. After that, sales kept declining and eventually dropped to around 40,000 units a year. Compared to Japanese competitors selling 500,000 cars annually, this looked clearly uncompetitive. GM was not ready to give up. The company caught the next shift in time as SUVs were starting to take over. At the Spring Hill plant, after the old S Series was discontinued, Saturn launched a new SUV, the View. Unlike the L Series, it actually looked interesting and still felt like a Saturn. You could see GM trying to bring back the brand's identity after the previous failure. That showed not only in the design, but also in the plastic body panels that remained one of Saturn's signature features. The View sold well. Just like with the S Series, Saturn hit the trend at the right moment, as demand for crossovers was taking off. Financially, the View became the brand's most successful model and finally started making money for GM. The problem was what that success actually meant. Saturn could only succeed once it stopped being Saturn. Beyond its styling and plastic panels, the View was a typical GM product, built on a global platform and, in its top versions, even using Honda engines. The success of the View marked the last chapter for Saturn. Everything that followed under the Saturn name is not really worth discussing. These were standard rebadged GM models with nothing left of the uniqueness that once defined the brand. Even in the way badge engineering was handled, you can see the decline. Early on, there was still an effort to make these cars feel different from their Opel counterparts. By the end, that effort was gone. Saturn was essentially selling Opels with a different badge, and in the case of the Opel Astra, they did not even bother to come up with a new name. Saturn's story came to an end in 2010. Over its lifetime, the brand produced around 4 million cars, and more than half of them came from the original S Series. To close, it is worth quoting Jim Hall, a member of the Car of the Year jury. The biggest mistake of Saturn was that GM never applied what it learned and failed to bring those changes into the rest of its dealer network. That is the brand's greatest failure. This is how the story of one of the most unusual and distinctive American brands came to an end.